How many times have you been told that you left Christianity because you just wanted to sin? I've heard this a lot, and I probably get it in my comments every single day. I've had everyone from my family members to strangers tell me that the reason I left is because I did not want to be held accountable to God, and that all I wanted to do was live a life of sin and fulfill all of my depraved desires. And that was the reason. That was why I chose to leave the faith. That's what they say. And I think this is such a funny accusation coming from the same crowd who uses Jesus as a scapegoat to escape the punishment for their own sins. The crowd that believes that all they have to do in order to be forgiven for anything that they do here on earth is ask an invisible deity inside their mind to forgive them for that. I think it's funny that the people who use Jesus as a scapegoat to escape the punishment for their own sins think that they are holding themselves accountable by letting someone else take their punishment. And so in a way, I think that it is actually the Christian who is escaping accountability for their actions and the things that they do if they are just letting God wash all their sins away and going to heaven, even though they admit that they deserve hell for their sins. Now, I don't think that anybody deserves hell for anything they do here on earth. But, according to the Christians, we all deserve hell. We've all done terrible things. We've all sinned against God. And luckily, Jesus is there to take that punishment away. But I'm trying to figure out how that's being held accountable for your sins at all. It would seem that me as a non-believer, not allowing Jesus to be the scapegoat, going to hell for my sins would be the definition of me taking accountability. But of course, Christians don't really see it that way. And so they have to point fingers and accuse me of just wanting to sin so that they can kind of maintain their sense of security in their own faith. And I have to say that most of the time when people say this to me, they are strangers who know nothing about my life. But I have had people from my past and family members who know me and knew my journey tell me this same thing. Hey, you just want to sin. You're just trying to live a life of sin. And my response to that is, if that was all it was, if it has nothing to do with my intellect or my critical thought, it has nothing to do with my non-belief, and my entire reason for walking away from Christianity could be reduced down to, I just want to sin, I would not have left Christianity. I would have had no need to leave Christianity. I would have just stayed a Christian, and I would have gone to church every Sunday, and I would have prayed for God to forgive me of all of my sins and been really, really genuine about it, and then just kept sinning. Because that's what all the Christians do anyway, right? I mean, isn't that what every Christian does? There isn't a Christian out there who is sinless. I have definitely had some Christians try to claim that they are sinless. And there are certainly Christians that will claim they are sinless once they are saved. And I don't really know how that works other than they're just denying the things that they do. But most Christians, I think, would agree that they still sin after they become saved. You don't stop sinning. Even Paul talked about this in his letters. Like, you're talking about how what he desires to do, he doesn't do, and he just keeps sinning, and it's such a struggle. And so this is something that I think all Christians struggle with. There are entire sermons preached on struggling with sin and how to overcome it in your life, but you're still saved. You're still in Jesus. You're still sanctified. It's just that you continue to sin, but when you sin, you're forgiven by God. You have the blood of Jesus to cover you and sanctify you. And so if it was true that all I wanted to do was sin, I would have just stayed a Christian. I would have had no reason to walk outside the faith and leave it. There had to be more to it than that. And all of us who have left Christianity know that there is more to it than that. But to the outsider, to the Christian who's accusing us of this, they just reduce it down. They just can't, they have a hard time accepting that it comes from a place of non-belief. If you still believe in Christianity, you believe in the Christian God, you believe in the consequences of sin and the consequences of not following God, you probably are just going to remain a Christian. You don't really have any reason to walk away. Somebody walks away when they stop believing, and belief is something that is outside of your control. You can't just wake up one day and say, you know what, I don't feel like believing in God anymore, so I'm not going to. It just doesn't work that way. You have to become convinced. It's a process, and belief is the result of becoming convinced of something. And so to reduce it down and to ignore the journey and the process that we go through and all of the intricacies of our journey is really frustrating for a lot of us. I think we get really frustrated when they just want to kind of reduce it down to something so simple, especially when we could have just stayed Christian, kept sinning, asked for forgiveness like they all do. But how interesting is it that what led me away, what made me stop believing, was recognizing the absolute immorality of the Bible, of its authors, and of the God of the Bible. When I saw things like genocide, sexual assault, endorsed slavery, taking people captive during war and doing whatever you want with them, treating people as spoils of war, committing genocide, all of these things I saw in the Bible, endorsed and condoned by God. And I said, I don't like that. I think that's really bad and immoral. And by worshiping this God, I by default make myself immoral because I'm worshiping and raising up an immoral God. It was the sins of God that drove me away. And everybody's got a different story. Some people will say it's the sins of the church that drove them away. And I think that's, just as valid. But for me, when I looked at the atrocities in the Bible, that's what drove me away. It had nothing to do with my own desires, what I wanted. What I wanted was to be a good Christian and to follow God. But instead, I found this God that was absolutely evil, a God full of sin. By the Bible's definition, a God full of sin. And so in a way, it was actually my disdain for sin or for evil that led me away. So how funny is it that they claim, and I think this is, probably the case for a lot of people. We walked away because what we were reading, we didn't align with ethically. And so how funny is it that they accuse us of leaving because we want to live this wild, depraved lifestyle when it was the depravity in the Bible that actually pushed many of us away. And I do think that a lot of times when they are lashing out and they are saying these things to us, especially those that do not know us, when they're just complete strangers on the internet, I do think that there is a bit of perhaps envy going on in their minds, whether they want to admit to it or not. I know personally for me, when I was a Christian, it was a struggle watching people who were not Christians, who did not abide by all of the strict rules within Christianity and all of the expectations, who were living this free, happy, carefree lifestyle where they were doing what they wanted, where they were enjoying life, where they weren't obligating themselves to these religious ideologies. And they were happy and free. And I was stuck having to obey God and do whatever he wanted to and not follow my own desires, not explore my own identity, not live this life of freedom and autonomy. That was a struggle. And I know a lot of Christians struggle when they look at other people living their best life without God. There's got to be some envy there. And so when they're just like, you just want to sin, I think that they want to sin and they're jealous that we get to sin guilt-free, shame-free. We don't have to live in the confines of all the guilt and the shame and the weight of disappointing God with every little action and every little thought and every little emotion. That's exhausting. And I do not blame them for being envious. I don't blame them at all. If I was still trapped in that, I would be envious too. I would be. So I completely understand where they're coming from, but I do think that whether they admit it or not, I think that they're jealous. Their indoctrinated mind doesn't allow them to go to that place. And so they get angry and they lash out. But there is one last thing that I want to address concerning this that I think might help anyone who is walking away, who is being accused of just wanting to sin, who is feeling very defensive and insecure about that accusation. Because again, they're reducing our very treacherous journey of losing everything that we've ever known to be true and having to literally rebuild from the ground up and figure out our existence and reality and life and ourselves. That is an intense, traumatic, awful journey. And for some people, it's way more awful than others. It can be such a difficult years-long journey. And so when they reduce that down to, you just want to sin, when they're trying to tell us that we are bad for doing it, that we are depraved, that all we're trying to do is be selfish and do bad things, that can be very frustrating. It can be infuriating, and it can just feel really bad. And so we can get very angry and defensive about that. But I have really shifted my perspective lately. I have learned to stop being so defensive all the time. And I'm not great at it. I still get very defensive. I am a very defensive person. It is just kind of how I am. And it's something I have really been working on for a long time. But I think if we shift our perspective and we stop trying to be so defensive about it and we just embrace it, I think that could be incredibly empowering for a lot of people. It has been incredibly empowering for me, because when they say you just want to sin, you might respond and you might say, well, what am I doing? What sin are you talking about? For me, I'm like, I spend my days just kind of chilling at home. I play Sims, I play with my dog, I cook for my husband, I go on hikes, I go to therapy, like those are the things I'm doing on a regular basis. So I don't really know where I have room for all of this, depravity and sin. But to them, every little thing is a sin. If you respond and you say, well, I'm not doing anything, I'm not going out and murdering people, I'm not going out and hurting people, what am I doing that's so wrong? They'll say, well, you're not living for God. You're cussing, or you're drinking, or you might go to a party here and there, or you might listen to secular music, or you might watch movies that don't glorify God. You might be exploring your sexual identity, and you might realize that you're trans. You might be living your most authentic life, and to them, all these little things you're doing that don't glorify God, that don't make God happy, they're sin. You're living in sin. And so my response to that now is not, no, I don't want to sin. It's yes. Yes, I do want to sin. Because what your concept of sin looks nothing like what my concept of immoral or unethical is. I live my life by what I think is moral and ethical. I don't live my life by how happy I think I'm going to make an invisible deity. And so when they say you just want to sin, you just want to not live for God, you just want to do things that God doesn't like, well, if God doesn't like the way I live my life, if God doesn't like the fact that I don't believe in him based on a severe lack of evidence on his part, and that's sin to him, then yes, I do want to sin. That's how I would like to live my life. That is what's most authentic to me. Because what a Christian defines as sin, I do not. I don't think that all of these things that Christians say are sin is wrong, which, by the way, Christians have all kinds of ideas about what's sin. Some Christians think it's a sin to take a sip of alcohol, while some Christians think that it's perfectly fine to drink whenever you want to. Jesus turned water into wine. Some Christians believe it is wrong to dance, while other Christians love to get down. So everybody has got their own subjective ideas about what sin is, which is like a whole other conversation. But whatever the person hurling this at me thinks sin is, yes, I probably do want to do those things. When we can kind of flip it around, and instead of getting defensive and feeling bad about the fact that somebody thinks you just want to sin, maybe it's just time to embrace it. Maybe it's just time to say, yeah, I do want to sin. Because what I see as sin are things that you praise, things like genocide, war, impregnating young girls with the Holy Spirit, really weird out there things that I think are not okay. What I think is sin, you praise. And what you think is sin, I praise. It's really just subjective at the end of the day. But that's where I come to. Yeah. If you think that me just living my most authentic life and being myself and not believing in things that I find to be unbelievable is a sin, then I want to spend the rest of my life sinning. And yes, I left Christianity to sin, and I'm okay with that. And so you see how empowering that can feel when you just flip it around, when you embrace it, when you roll with it, and you don't feel the need to defend it, but instead you just say, you know what, that's the way it is. I think you're living in sin too when you're worshiping an immoral God. But, you do you, I'll do me, and that'll be that at the end of the day. When people disregard what we've been through and the pain and the trauma, it can just feel bad. It can. And so I fully relate to that. I understand it if you feel that way too, if you feel bad when people say things like that to you. But I think it's really important that we remember that it comes from a place on their part of ignorance of you and your journey and what you've done, but also a place of insecurity within themselves. The only reason they're saying it is because they see you living your best life. They see you carving out your most authentic path. They see you happy and free, and they can't reconcile that with someone who once believed and followed God, because if it can happen to you, it could happen to them. And that is very scary. And not everybody wants to go through this process that we've gone through to deconstruct. And I don't blame people for that. It's a very scary, difficult process. And I lost so much to go through it, but I also gained a lot. And I'm happy that I did it. I'm really happy that I did it. And so now I'm at a point where it doesn't matter what they accuse me of. It doesn't matter what they say. I know who I am. I know my journey. And I know why they do it and why they say it. And recognizing those things can be so beneficial in just shifting your perspective moving forward so that these things don't affect you as much. They don't hold you back. They go in one ear and out the other. You can let it roll off your shoulders and you can just move on and you can embrace the life that you're living, knowing that it is the most authentic life for you. Thank you so much for joining me today. Please like and subscribe, leave a comment, do the things that helps me out a lot. Don't forget, I do have a merch shop, jezebelvibes.com/shop. I'll link it in the description. I also have a TikTok at christy.burke. It's where I share more of my hot takes. And we have a little bit more snarky fun over there. So yeah, I think that's all I've got, and I'll see you next time.